Hi, it's Richard Dwyer, keeping it free.blogspot.com. Also, money1776.com. Today is March the 3rd, 2026, approximately 1 year and 2 weeks after the death of Clint Hill. You might recall Clint Hill was the Secret Service agent who jumps on the back of the presidential limousine moments after JFK gets shot. Right? Let's talk about it, but first remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now let me give a little preface here. In time, each succeeding generation is a little bit smarter, more knowledgeable, more aware, has access to more resources than the prior generation, right? I know we want to characterize young people as, confused and lackadaisical and not as committed as older generations. But I need for folks to understand that there's a level of sophistication today, in part, group knowledge of forensic evidence, group awareness of the importance of DNA evidence. In some cases, we even differentiate the DNA evidence, right? There's touch DNA, then there's regular DNA, right? Today, people really are fixated on CCTV, cell phone towers, where people are. The awareness of evidence far beyond fingerprint evidence, quite frankly, didn't exist at this level before. Now, through that lens, the Kennedy assassination is an obvious bad cover-up. You understand it couldn't have happened the way they claimed, right? You understand that firmly. In the 1960s, they sold that story to the public, right? I was a young kid once, growing up in the 70s and 80s, and people actually believed the story, right? During the Cold War, you thought there were communists and then there was everyone else. And Lee Harvey Oswald, former Marine, guy who had lived in Minsk, guy who had defected to the Soviet Union, was viewed as a communist. Right? The motivation for the murder, even though Kennedy is a Democrat, so it really doesn't make sense, but the motivation was that some communist wanted to lash out at the power structure of the United States. Right? That was the story. Well, what I want people to do is to realize that we now know some facts that, quite frankly, discredit the story. For you to believe the official version, as I've discussed in previous videos, you have to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald is a lone nut, that he's acting alone. No one's in cahoots with him, right? There couldn't be any real tie between him and members of the intelligence community, right? That would be too far of a reach, right? We'll overlook the fact that he's in contact with James Hosty, an FBI agent. We'll overlook the fact that he actually attended a John Birch Society meeting, which is inconsistent with him being a communist, right? We'll overlook the fact that his landlord actually attended the John Birch Society meeting with him, right? And was involved, his family was involved in the development of Bell helicopter. We'll overlook all of those facts, but there's one we can't overlook, right? Just understand, and we know this, do your own research, right? Just understand that the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald's landlord was best friends with Allen Dulles', the former CIA director's, mistress. We know that now. In other words, there isn't that far a degree of separation between Oswald, who we're supposed to believe just happened to be living with the Paynes, right? We're supposed to believe that, Ruth Payne wanted to learn Russian, and so, she gravitated to this family, right? They even take the political side off the table in the carefully constructed 1960s era version of events, right? Ruth Payne wants to improve her Russian. Here's Marina Oswald, right? We're supposed to believe that it's happenstance that the Oswalds end up living with Michael Payne's family, and it's complete coincidence that Michael Payne's mother just happens to be best friends with Allen Dulles' mistress. Folks, you understand the odds of that happening, and Oswald then happening to be someone who decides to kill President Kennedy and who happens to be working right by the new motorcade route, right? The route was changed, and just happens to go undetected with a rifle, even though he's working several floors up, right? We're supposed to believe that all of that happened by chance, right? Well, what I want people to do is, in the comment section of this video, I have an interview of Clint Hill. Right now, Clint Hill is the closest person to the president who's not a passenger in the car. Right? He's on the back of the limo within seconds of the gunshots being heard. Right? He's right by the president. He's the one who gets Jackie back in the limo as she's reaching for matter. Now, that's very important. So, in the video I'm posting, and folks, it's uncensored. I haven't censored it. What I want you to do, right, click the link. It'll show that the Warren Commission was a dog and pony show. It should prove to you that the Warren Commission wasn't serious about what they were doing, that it was all propaganda. It should prove to you that the mafia couldn't have been involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. There's zero chance, because the cover-up necessarily had to involve the government from early on. At 4:45 of the Clint Hill video, Clint Hill starts talking about what happened in the seconds after he hears a sound that he believes might be a gunshot. Right? Let me point out that the acoustics, according to Clint Hill, were bad at Dealey Plaza. Right? I'm going to have a second link in the comments section. I'll pin these, right, of an excellent series of videos. It's going to be one on Clint Hill, where they talk about what Clint Hill said to people privately. But just understand, you have Clint Hill himself telling you, starting at the 4:45 mark, what happened. And you have Clint Hill telling you at the 5:30 mark that when he looks at the president's head, right, this is when he's on the back of the limo moments after the shots ring out. When he looks at the president's head, there's a hole in the president's skull, and the president's brain is gone. Right, folks? This is a witness. This is a Secret Service agent moments after the assassination. Keep in mind, we also have a Zapruder film, right, that shows matter coming out of Kennedy's head. Right, we know from the Zapruder film that Jackie reaches for something. Right, we know all of this. Just be aware that the autopsy purports to have a brain from President Kennedy. And just be aware that the autopsy purports that that brain practically had 100% mass. In fact, the brain was bigger than the normal human brain. Right? So the question you have to ask yourself is, who do you believe? If you believe Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent on the back of the limo, right? By the way, Clint Hill, according to another Secret Service agent, the one who wrote the book, who, says that he found the magic bullet in the back seat and brought it to Parkland Hospital. Understand, Clint Hill tells him not to go public with the story. Right? Just understand, Clint Hill, and you'll see it yourself, says that he looked at the president, he saw the president's brain was out of his head, and he saw that the president's eyes were vacant. Right? Folks, that's a Secret Service person. Understand, the brain referred to in the autopsy, according to our government, then goes missing. In other words, they had a brain, and anyone involved with medical schools and medical training knows that these wannabe doctors always have cadavers that they are working on and stuff like that. In other words, you could get a brain from a cadaver. Just understand that there's a brain, and according to our government, at some point, they lost possession of the brain. The brain supposedly goes missing while in our government's possession. So here's the point. If the autopsy's faked to the point where they're producing a fake brain that hasn't lost mass, right, for an assassination where if you look at the Zapruder film, you see the lost mass. If you listen to Clint Hill, the man closest to the president, the brain's blown out of his head. Right? If you believe that the government faked the autopsy, just recognize, or that the autopsy's faked, just recognize that the mob couldn't do that. The Russians couldn't do that. The Cubans couldn't do that. A lone gunman could not do that. Right? No, folks, the United States government, the intelligence community could pull it off. Right? Not Jack Ruby, not Santos Trafficante. Right? If you believe that the brain referred to in the autopsy is not Kennedy's brain, that could only be done by the people Harry S. Truman. Research this. Research this on YouTube. The people Harry S. Truman, who formed the intelligence community, thought may have done the assassination. Right? The group French President Charles de Gaulle thought did the assassination. Right? Understand, Eisenhower, the Goliath in the room. His farewell speech to the American public talked about how the military-industrial complex had to be reined in. This is before Kennedy's assassination. Right, folks? The group that did this assassination, as I see it, had to be the U.S. government. So, for the autopsy, they didn't have Cyril Wecht do the autopsy. They didn't have an elite person do the autopsy. Right now, what they did is they had a military person do the autopsy. Right, folks? This is a coup. That's what the Kennedy assassination was, and it's not a good coup. Right? You know, just understand that what they presented to the public, Arlen Specter's magic bullet theory, falls apart once you look at the chain of custody of the bullet. Right? They didn't have the evidence to even convict, had it gone to trial, the guy they were framing, Lee Harvey Oswald. Right? Just recognize that. So, again, please, you don't have to believe me. Believe Clint Hill. Right? I have two links. One is to Clint Hill himself talking as an older man about what he saw. The other is to a video from an excellent series that's revisiting the Kennedy assassination. Right? You know, it helps hide what actually happened when people suspect that the mob was involved. Right? You need to understand that a Dallas police officer runs onto the grassy knoll, right after the shots are fired. And he runs into a guy who claims he's Secret Service and who flashes credentials. Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have someone on the grassy knoll. You know that. Right? You know, the people who would be on the grassy knoll would be part of an intelligence operation. Also, think about it. The Kennedy assassination has to be one of the most significant assassinations in American history. Right? You mean to tell me that there was a bone fragment that looked like it came from the back of someone's head in Dealey Plaza after this assassination? It wasn't found by a government official. Of course they wouldn't want to find it, because it would show that the shot came from the front and blew off the back of Kennedy's head. Right? So believe it or not, a civilian found the Harper fragment. Right? This is a bone from the back of someone's head. How many of those do you believe were in Dealey Plaza in November of 1963? So, you know what happened? The government got the Harper fragment. The civilian turns it into the government. The civilian's family turns in the Harper fragment to the government. Where is that fragment today? Because today we'd be able to say, this DNA matches the president's DNA. This came from the president. Right? How could the back of the president's head have been blown off by a shot from the back? Well, you know what happened to the Harper fragment? As I've mentioned in other videos, like the president's brain, the Harper fragment was lost by our government while in our government's custody. How could that happen, folks, for an assassination of this magnitude? So please, study Clint Hill. Recognize that he was a patriot actually trying to help, the powers that be make this look like a lone nut assassination, right? He didn't want his buddy, who's written a book now, he didn't want his buddy pointing out that the magic bullet was actually one he found in the back seat. Right? Understand, that day, think about it, the President of the United States gets assassinated under very shady circumstances, and his Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, then orders the limousine to be cleaned. If you saw this on an episode of CSI, you would say, what are they doing? Right? If you're watching one of these crime shows and there's a murder scene, you know the cops would blow it if they came in and said, you know what, clean up all this blood before forensics has an opportunity to look at it. But yet, that's what happened here with Kennedy's assassination. So Truman understood, everyone in the room, I believe, understood that the CIA had been involved in coups overseas. The CIA was upset with what happened with the Bay of Pigs. Allen Dulles was upset with being fired by President Kennedy. Right? Kennedy, first-term president, youngest elected president in American history. Right? Kennedy was upsetting the apple cart. Kennedy was talking about a new approach to diplomatic relations. People knew that the Cuban Missile Crisis is resolved in part by Kennedy's promise to withdraw missiles from Europe. People also knew, and I believe this is part of it, Kennedy has a Boy Scout war hero public image. In private, Kennedy's sleeping with a lot of people. In private, Kennedy is fooling around with Sam Giancana's mistress. In private, she's calling the White House. It's in the phone logs. Right? Kennedy's hanging around Frank Sinatra. Right? Kennedy is fooling around with, women, at least one, who we know might have been intelligence agents for a foreign country. So understand, the people around Kennedy thought that he was too different. Right? Kennedy even is getting shots from a doctor they call Dr. Feelgood. Look him up. Was a literal person giving Kennedy shots, and some believe Kennedy suffered from depression. Understand, Kennedy had been in the military. Right? Kennedy may have had some PTSD. And of course, there's a civil rights angle to Kennedy. Right? Dr. King, he has over at the White House. Kennedy tells King and his henchman, Baynard Rustin, who is openly a homosexual. Right? He's not in the closet, folks, in the early 60s. Kennedy tells them, I'd rather you not do the March on Washington. Right? Keep in mind, too, from the Oval Office, Kennedy authors the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Right? This is not some later president having lobbyists write a health care bill. No, this is President Kennedy, who barely wins the 60 election, if you believe he wins the 60 election. Don't just look at dead people voting in Chicago. You need to look at ballots floating in the river in Texas, Lyndon Johnson's state. Think about it. Kennedy has a Texan on the ticket and barely wins Texas. Right? So understand, this is a president who barely gets in office, and he's doing things like writing a Civil Rights Act at a time when there's still Jim Crow in the South, and when it's still illegal in many states for people of different races to get married. Right? So just understand, Kennedy, Dr. King and Baynard Rustin tell Kennedy, no, we're going to have a march on Washington. And what does President Kennedy do? Kennedy backs it. Let's go one step further, too. This is the Cold War. This is a time when the CIA participates in the removal of a democratically elected Patrice Lumumba, remember that name, from the Congo, right? He gets assassinated by a member of the military that the U.S. backed, right? What does Kennedy do at this time of Cold War America? Kennedy founds the Peace Corps, right? So I know today it's not apparent. In the 1960s, folks, Kennedy's a full-blown radical, right? And of course, he's Roman Catholic, the first Roman Catholic president in American history, right? So just understand, the knives were out for Kennedy. The level of the conspiracy was such that the president's autopsy had a brain that I believe was not his. It has a brain that's inconsistent with Clint Hill's testimony. Right? Doctors at Parkland, Robert McClellan, talk about the hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Right, folks? The autopsy photos are doctored. Where's the hole? How many people in this singular event, right? Clint Hill, I'm sure this is the only presidential assassination he's been around. He would remember what he saw. Right? Dr. McClellan at Parkland would remember what he saw. Right? Now, just think about it. If the Warren Commission was real, right? Let's be clear here. They would be asking a simple question. How could Clint Hill look in the president's head, see the brain mostly blown out, but yet the autopsy has a full brain, a brain that's bigger than normal size? Right? Now, keep in mind, Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, did not want to be on the Warren Commission. I believe Richard Russell told the president that he just didn't believe that Oswald could be so precise with his shooting. We know now that Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano was misaligned. The FBI couldn't duplicate the shooting. Right? We know now that the doctor who initially looked at Kennedy's throat wound thought it was an entry wound. We also know that Gerald Ford, now Ford may have been an athlete, Ford may have been smarter than you think. Ford's move to allow private ownership of gold, again in the United States in the 70s, after decades of Americans not being allowed to privately hold gold, is one of the biggest pieces of legislation of the last century. But what Gerald Ford was not was a doctor, a medical doctor. You'll find out that Gerald Ford's the person who moves the bullet hole on the back of Kennedy, right, in a Warren Commission document. Right, folks, the Warren Commission, if it was real, would have been asking the question of where did the brain mentioned in Kennedy's autopsy come from? They would have guarded that brain, because if they could show that that brain didn't match Kennedy, wasn't Kennedy's brain, they would know there was a cover-up and this was an inside job. There wouldn't be any question. Instead, the Warren Commission, unaware that the Secret Service agent would, later point out that he's the one who found the magic bullet in the back seat. Understand what that means. That means Connolly's wounds in the front seat were not caused by the magic bullet. Right? And of course that Secret Service member says he's the one who brought it to Parkland Hospital. Right? Think about that. Right? Just understand the Warren Commission instead, through Arlen Specter, and I think the young people on the Warren Commission didn't realize they were being used. Right? Specter's just a young guy at the time. Specter later becomes, of course, a U.S. Senator. But it's Arlen Specter who comes up with the magic bullet theory. Folks, we now know that that's false. Understand, no one's talking about it, but we now know that if the magic bullet did not hit Connolly in the front seat, there had to be a second shooter. We know that now. No one's talking about it. But we know Oswald couldn't have acted alone. Right? Let's go one step further. Dallas police step in. We know Dallas should have done the autopsy. Right? We know it's illegal under Texas law for the feds to muscle Kennedy's corpse out of Dallas. But yet that's what happened. Right? The people in Dallas wouldn't have faked the autopsy. Right? No, the federal government, the feds, muscled Kennedy's corpse out of Dallas. So understand what happens. Oswald's in police custody, right? Recognize that there's certain mysteries involving Oswald. Right? You're hearing about more than one wallet. I'm not talking about the ID now. I'm not talking about Lee Harvey Oswald and Alex Siddell. I'm talking about a wallet found by J.D. Tippit, and then, of course, a wallet that Oswald has on him at the Texas Theater. Right? But understand, Oswald is in Dallas police custody. He's sitting across from one of the foremost interrogators in the state of Texas. Right? The state of Dallas has this investigation at that point. So what happens? This is part of the historical record, folks. The FBI agent who had been communicating with Lee Harvey Oswald suddenly enters the room. So you have Texas law enforcement, they're with this guy and they're talking with this guy. Right? If you believe the Texas law enforcement side of the ledger, when they encounter Oswald at the Texas Theater, Oswald pulls his gun. But his gun jams. Oswald is prepared at that point to kill cops. So here they are with Oswald. And just understand, James Hosty comes in. Right? He wants to ask Oswald questions in the middle of Texas law enforcement's questioning of Oswald. Right? Now understand, the key Texas investigator, in talking to Oswald, actually sensed that there was more to Oswald. That Oswald's not a punk. So understand what James Hosty wanted to talk with Lee Harvey Oswald about during the interrogation of Oswald by police. Hosty wanted to know if Oswald had recently visited the Texas Embassy. the Mexico City embassy. Right now, folks, let me make a basic point here. We have a photo of the person who was claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald at the Mexico City embassy. And it's not Lee Harvey Oswald. Right? Who could put that together in government files? Again, not the mob, not the Russians, not the Cubans. Right? No, the only people who could put that together in our government's files was our government. Right? And of course, Oswald plays along with Hosty. He's upset when Hosty shows up at the interrogation. Oswald believed that Hosty was, nagging his wife, was trying to single out his wife because his wife was a Russian national. Right now, let's ask the question: is Oswald part of a CIA, whether he shoots the shots or not? Is he part of some CIA coup to kill the President of the United States? Is this all rehearsed? Right, here is Oswald arrested for one of the biggest crimes of the 20th century, and an FBI agent comes in and there's talk of suddenly Mexico City. Oswald's wife. So let's say you're a Dallas law enforcement guy and you're looking at Oswald, he's an American, you're talking to him. Oh, now you know early in the interrogation that Oswald's married to a Russian at a time of the Cold War. Right, so folks, I'll just say this. The autopsy's faked. You know that because military veterans like Clint Hill, right, people serving their country, put his life at risk. Shots are being fired. He hops on the vehicle. He gets the First Lady back in the car. Then he's tending to the President of the United States. Right? This is a patriot. This is a guy who is risking his life. This is what Secret Service people do. Right? He looks in the President's head. Folks, he's not going to be confused here. This doesn't happen every day in his life. He looks in the President's head. He remembers what he saw. And the President's brain is mostly gone. You know he's telling the truth because you yourself can look on the Zapruder film and you see everything popping out of the President's head. So you yourself know. Right? You yourself know that the President couldn't have a regular-sized brain during the autopsy. The fact that the government is pushing this regular-sized brain, which of course goes missing in their custody later, should tell you who did the assassination. Also, the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, right, defects to the Soviet Union and then magically is allowed to come back to the United States with a Russian wife. And then, surprisingly, ends up living with a landlord whose mother is the best friend of Allen Dulles' mistress. That fact by itself should discredit the narrative. So, Clint Hill is no longer with us. What I want people to do is to listen to him in the interview talk about the brain. Now, if he's giving interviews where he's saying the President's brain is mostly gone, why wasn't this known to the Warren Commission? How could anyone, even Gerald Ford, look at the film, the Zapruder film, and not know that the President's brain is mostly blown out of his head? How could there be a regular-sized brain? The biggest question of all is, given that President Truman immediately suspected the intelligence community. Right? Look up Charles de Gaulle here online. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, suspected the American intelligence community. Right? You know the president fired Allen Dulles. The Warren Commission should have known. Dulles had a mistress who's in her circle. If anyone related to Lee Harvey Oswald's landlord is in that social circle, that should disqualify Allen Dulles from the Warren Commission. Just like Allen Dulles would be disqualified from any jury in the United States. Right? Instead, incredibly, Lyndon Johnson puts Dulles on the Warren Commission. According to folklore, the mole for the FBI on the Warren Commission was Gerald Ford. Right? You should look at the 70s. You should listen to the Nixon tapes. There's a moment on the tapes when Nixon is going down. He's desperate. He calls in a member of the intelligence community and he says to them, I know about that Bay of Pigs thing. Folks, it's on the Nixon tapes. I know about that Bay of Pigs thing. It's a threat to the intelligence person he's talking to. What Nixon is saying, and Nixon, of course, when he leaves office, has his own private security detail. What Nixon is saying is, I know about the coup that you guys did earlier. Don't mess with me. That's what Nixon's saying. Well, just understand, and I don't think people have connected the dots here. Nixon had a VP, Spiro Agnew. Agnew turned out to be corrupt. Right? Nixon ends up with Gerald Ford as his vice president. Right? By then, certainly Nixon had to know that he had covered up the Watergate burglary. Nixon had to know that this vice president was more likely to become president than most. Right? So Nixon resigns. Gerald Ford pardons Nixon. Think about that. Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States. He loses to Jimmy Carter, an unknown, in '76. So then you have Ronald Reagan. Reagan wins the presidency. He's the Republican nominee. Right? And he has to pick a vice president. This is before the election of 1980. Right? He has to pick a vice president. Folks, it's interesting that he picks a vice president who served on the Warren Commission. It's interesting that Nixon, talking about the Bay of Pigs thing on his private tapes, picks Gerald Ford as his vice president. Right? So understand what happened. Go back and look at the 1980 GOP convention. Reagan wants Ford as his VP. After all, Reagan is running against an incumbent, right? He's up against Jimmy Carter. We had the misery index. We had Carter, pushing whip inflation now buttons and stuff like that. But Carter was the incumbent. The two men only had one debate. Right? It's very hard to beat an incumbent in a presidential election. Reagan wanted a VP for a host of reasons. I believe one of those reasons was to wink at those concerned, particularly after the 77 congressional hearings on the Kennedy assassination, about what happened with Kennedy. Right? In other words, there's a whole group that may have been involved in the Kennedy assassination. Right? So Reagan picking Ford as a running mate would have allayed that group. Right? Just to understand what happened. Ford comes in and wants a co-presidency. This has been swept under the rug in American history. In other words, the people voted for Reagan. Ford comes in and says, I'll only serve as your VP if I have all of this power. Reagan then declined. So who does Reagan pick? Someone he hated. Someone who called Reaganomics voodoo economics. These guys did not get along. Reagan picks former CIA director George H.W. Bush. Right? So understand, if you believe the CIA killed Kennedy, right? If you believe that Lyndon Johnson was complicit in that, you have Ford from the Warren Commission suddenly showing up on Nixon's team, right, as his vice president after Agnew, leaves the stage, right? And then you have Ford being resurrected by Ronald Reagan after, of course, the Congressional Committee in '77 found that there was a conspiracy. Right? So, folks, all you have to do is think about the idea of the long odds that Lee Harvey Oswald's family would randomly end up living with the Paynes, and that Michael Payne's mother was best friends with Alan Dulles' mistress, right? To understand that the official version isn't feasible. When you look closer to, you're going to find that Ruth Payne traveled long distances, right, to bring the Oswalds into her household, right? At one point, they moved to New Orleans, and folklore has it that Ruth Payne, who, was separated from Michael Payne, that's the official story we're hearing, wanted a housemate and was interested in learning Russian better. So she travels to get Marina and their child. Right, folks? Don't believe the official version. Well, I don't believe the official version. I want everyone to think for themselves after they look at the links that I'm posting to an interview of Clint Hill, as well as a discussion of Clint Hill. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.